My name is John Cottingham. I'm Professor Emeritus of Philosophy at the University of Reading and an Honorary Fellow at St John's College, Oxford University. My main research interests are early modern philosophy, especially Descartes, and also moral philosophy and the philosophy of religion. Today, I want to talk about René Descartes and his journey from self-knowledge to knowledge of God. How indubitable is his starting point, and how certain is his destination. But let me begin with the very first sentence Descartes uses to open his metaphysical masterpiece, the Meditations, published in Latin in 1641. He says, "Some years ago I was struck by the large number of falsehoods that I'd accepted as true in my childhood, and by the highly doubtful nature of the whole edifice I'd subsequently based on them. I realized that it was necessary, once in the course of my life, to demolish everything completely and start again right from the foundations if I wanted to establish anything in the sciences that was stable and likely to last. So the aim is to sweep away the rubble of previous prejudice and preconceived opinion and establish a solid system of philosophy on certain foundations." Descartes would go on to formulate a whole theory of mathematical physics based on precise quantitative principles, laws governing the size, shape, and motion of particles. So he's a kind of early herald of the modern scientific revolution. But the starting point of his new philosophical system is much more personal. He starts from the I, the thinking self. Descartes' first principle is one of the most famous pronouncements in all philosophy. As he put it in French in 1637, in his first published work, The Discourse on the Method, "Je pense, donc je suis," or in the Latin translation of that work, "Cogito ergo sum." I am thinking, therefore I exist. Descartes' famous pronouncement is often called the cogito for short. Everything else, Descartes insists, could be doubted. A lot of our beliefs are based on sensory data, but the senses, sight, hearing, and so on, can often mislead us. Even something seemingly so straightforward and simple as the belief that I'm sitting here in a chair might be false. I might be dreaming, for example, so that I'm not sitting here at all but lying asleep in bed. But one thing can't be doubted, that I am now thinking. If I doubt that I'm thinking, then that doubt is a thought, so I must still be thinking. And if I'm thinking, I must exist. As Descartes puts it in the Meditations, I exist is certain so long as it's put forward by me or conceived in the mind. In the centuries before Descartes, a great deal of philosophy had been based on the kind of step-by-step deductive reasoning mapped out by Aristotle in what's called the syllogism. The most famous example is, all humans are mortal, Socrates is human, therefore, conclusion, Socrates is mortal. Descartes was interviewed in 1648 by a young Dutchman, Franz Boerman, who asked him if the reasoning in the cogito was like that. Was he saying, everything that thinks exists, I think, therefore, conclusion, I exist? But Descartes made it clear that it's not like this. He declared, when someone says I'm thinking, therefore I exist, he does not deduce existence from thought by means of a syllogism, but recognizes it as self-evident by a simple intuition of the mind. The term intuition comes from the Latin intueor, meaning to look at or see. So the meditator doesn't need to invoke any general principles, but just intuits or sees straight off that in this individual case, if I'm thinking, I must exist. You don't need any formal deductions or blackboard reasoning. You just need to follow in Descartes' footsteps and actually do the meditation, and you or anyone will reach this self-evident starting point. Notice there's nothing necessary or permanent about Descartes' famous first principle. I might stop thinking at any time. Indeed, I might cease to exist at any time. But what can't be doubted is that so long as I'm thinking, I exist. As Descartes puts it, I am, I exist is certain, but for how long? Only as long as I'm actually thinking. It's an extraordinary idea when you think of it, to try and build up a whole philosophical system from this personal, private, individual starting point. After all, if I'm really doubting everything, left entirely to my own resources, can I really know anything at all? Even being able to think in the first place seems to presuppose an objective structure of meaning. I must know what thought is, what existence is, and see the connection between thinking and existing. A modern critic might put it like this: the meditator's supposedly private, first-person reflections surely already presuppose a public structure of language and meaning. So Descartes' idea of starting from myself, doubting everything outside of my mind, may be incoherent. Thought, language, concepts, all this must surely already imply a public domain. When asked about this, Descartes admitted that in order to arrive at knowledge of one's own existence, one must indeed have at one's disposal an apparatus of fundamental concepts, like thought and existence, that one can grasp clearly and rationally. Descartes actually believed we have innate, inborn, God-given knowledge of these basic concepts and the connections between them. Despite appearances, then, the cogito doesn't come out of a vacuum. As soon as I start to think, I'm in touch with a domain of meaning that I didn't make up for myself. So it turns out, according to Descartes, that I can be sure not just about I think, therefore I am, but about a host of other clear and distinct perceptions of the mind, as he calls them, simple truths that I intuit with such blinding clarity that they can't be doubted. In pushing doubt to its very limits, Descartes introduced the famous supposition of a malicious demon. There might, for all he knows, be a malicious demon bent on deceiving him in any possible way. But even this extreme form of doubt can't shake his knowledge of the clearest perceptions of the mind. As Descartes says in the third meditation, "Let whoever can do so deceive me. He'll never bring it about that I'm nothing so long as I continue to think I am something, or bring it about that 2 and 3 added together are more or less than 5. So as long as I actually hold in front of my mind the proposition that 2 and 3 make 5, there's nothing that could make it false." So what happens here is that the meditator comes up against truths that, so long as he focuses on them, constrain or compel his assent, whether he likes it or not. So despite Descartes beginning with the I, the individual thinking self, there's already an implicit dependency here. Descartes often stresses the frail, temporary nature of his self-awareness. Not only is such awareness a flickering candle of certainty that could be extinguished at any minute, but Descartes soon proceeds to use this very fragility of his thinking as a decisive indicator of his complete dependence on a power greater than himself. Just as St. Augustine had done many centuries earlier, Descartes' meditator descends into his own interior self in order to discover his creator. How does this work? Well, in my awareness of myself, I'm at once aware of my imperfection and weakness. For example, I know that there are many things I don't know, many things I can't do. And my very recognition of this imperfection already presupposes a conception of some greater and more perfect reality. As Descartes' meditator puts it, how could I understand that I doubted and desired, that is, lacked something, and that I was not wholly perfect, unless there were in me some idea of a more perfect being which enabled me to recognize my own defects by comparison. Descartes goes on to argue on a highly controversial piece of reasoning known as the trademark argument, that he couldn't have arrived at this idea of perfection from his own resources. And so the idea must have been placed in his mind ultimately by an infinitely perfect being, God, who stamps the idea of himself on the mind of the meditator like the mark of a craftsman stamped on his work. Descartes' critics have argued there's no reason why we can't arrive at the idea of the infinite by a process of extrapolating from our own awareness of our limitedness, our finitude. But for Descartes, the very awareness that we are finite and limited already implicitly presupposes we have a prior concept of the infinite. So what happens in the meditations is a kind of encounter, an encounter of the finite mind which comes up against the infinite, something that exceeds its power to fully grasp or encompass, but which nonetheless it can clearly understand and reach towards in its thought. Here I think we can recognize something paradoxical about Descartes' project. On the one hand, we have the image of the lonely, isolated meditator setting out boldly to overturn tradition and construct a new system quite independently, using only the unaided resources of his own mind. But on the other hand, as soon as this process gets underway, the meditator immediately comes up against the mind's imperfection, its dependency on a power greater than itself. So Descartes' project, the famous Cartesian project of constructing a new system of knowledge, actually turns out to be rooted in a very traditional God-centered metaphysics. Knowledge is possible only through a recognition of our creatureliness, the recognition that we're not self-sufficient or self-creating, but are limited, finite, dependent on a power infinitely greater than ourselves. This is a vision that may not be congenial to the secularist climate of today's philosophy. But if we want to see where Descartes is coming from, I think we need to take seriously what you could call this submissive strand in his thinking, a strand that becomes unmistakably clear at the end of the third meditation, when, after moving from self-awareness to awareness of God, the meditator says, Here let me pause for a while and gaze at, wonder at, and adore the beauty of this immense light. The vision may not be as modern as might be expected for a thinker who is often called the father of modern philosophy. But if we want to be true to Descartes' intentions, we need to understand how his very modern aspiration to develop a mathematically based scientific system presupposes the idea of the human mind as illuminated by a divine source of truth and goodness, without which no knowledge and no science would be possible.